Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out in this chilly weather. I know you're going to have a good time tonight. I'm Tracy Glab, Executive Director of the Flint Institute of Arts Museum and Art School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Sheppy Dog Fun Lecture. Tonight, we have Dr. Susan Wood presenting God Kings and Deified Emperors in Ancient Societies. The Sheppy Dog Fun Lecture Series was established in 2012 by Dr. Alan Klein to address the topics of art, religion, and history prior to the 19th century. Thank you, Dr. Klein, for continuing to bring these wonderful lectures to the FIA. The next Sheppy Dog Fun Lecture will be virtual, so you can have your pajamas on and have some popcorn or whatever. It's not going to be in person. It's on February 15th with Dr. Noah Charney, who will speak on the Zodiac Fountain and the hunt for stolen Chinese art. And if you are not familiar with him, he's an expert on art crime. So he's a very interesting person to listen to. He was here a few years ago for the Thompson Lecture, and he's also going to come back in person later on, more details to follow. So to watch this lecture, you just go to our website on our lectures page, and there's a button that says Watch Live Lecture. You just click on that at 6 p.m. on February 15th, and you're taken to our YouTube page, and you can watch. So you don't have to register. You can just click on the lecture. Also on our YouTube page, you will find all of the past Sheppy Dog Fun lectures and other lectures that we have had at the FIA, so you can get a whole world-class education just by spending a few weeks on our YouTube channel. Before I introduce our guest, I would like to thank the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation for their continued support, which is so deeply appreciated and vital to the FIA. I would like to thank the citizens of Genesee County for demonstrating their support of the FIA by means of the Genesee County Arts, Education, and Cultural Enrichment Millage, which also provides free entry to the FIA for Genesee County residents 7 days a week. A big thank you to Huntington Bank for sponsoring Huntington Free Saturdays, which allows everyone beyond our county free entry on Saturdays. And thank you to the Ford Foundation Equity Fund of the Community Foundation of Greater Flint for making the ASL interpretation possible tonight. So please give a round of applause for all of those patrons and supporters of the FIA, which help us do great things. Please take a moment right now to silence your cell phones or electronic devices, which also includes your watch, in my case. Dr. Susan Wood is a former professor of art history at Oakland University and received degrees from Bryn Mawr College and Columbia University. Her areas of specialization are Roman art and archaeology, numismatics, and French neoclassical painting. That's a great combination. She is the Archaeological Institute of America's 2009-2010 Metcalf Lecturer. Her publications include Imperial Women, a study in public images. Everyone, please join me in a warm Flint welcome for Dr. Susan Wood.
Well, Tracy Glab, many thanks for your kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming out on this cold and snowy night. I hope whatever I have to say will be worth it. So, it's an honor. I'm honored by your invitation. I have a little problem with the shadow from the microphone. I need to stand. Okay, now I think I have it solved. I'm honored by your invitation to present a lecture in this distinguished series. These lectures, as you know, discuss the interrelated roles of art and religion in ancient societies, and my study is the art of the Roman Empire. I've decided to focus on a religious practice that came into Roman society from the Near East and specifically from Egypt. It is a custom that we today find quite alien, or at least we did until perhaps somewhat recently, the worship of a living or recently deceased person as a god. This little shrine in Myceno in Italy, now reconstructed in a museum, is an example of that practice. Inside the temple, excavators found these two statues, nude statues, a format typically reserved for gods. They have the portrait faces of the Emperor Vespasian and his son Titus. The armor by the side of each statue and the generals' capes over their shoulders indicate the men's roles in life, but the nudity and the heroic pose elevate them to a timeless status. Outside the temple, however, as you can see here in the corner, and we'll see a little bit better in the next slide, stood a statue of the emperor who was alive at the time. He is Domitian, the son of Vespasian and the younger brother of Titus. We see him wearing his armor and very much in action, riding his war horse into battle. The statues of Vespasian and Titus would receive offerings, incense burned at the altars in front of them, and prayers, but Domitian's would not. A college of priests known as the Augustales built this temple and conducted the rites of the cult. These priests were not people of high social rank. Instead, they were generally freedmen, former slaves who had received manumission and citizenship. Freedmen sometimes had the wealth to pay for buildings like this, especially if their former masters had left them property. They were, however, in the lowest class of a very class-conscious society. These priesthoods offered them prestige in their communities. In other words, there was something in this deification business, not only for the imperial family, but for the priests of the cult. As we will see, deification could often be a grassroots phenomenon, but whether it came from below or above, it always had to benefit the living of all regions and classes of the empire. Only 2 centuries earlier, during the Roman Republic, such a practice would have been unthinkable. The custom of deification arrived in Rome when the Republic collapsed and Rome became a monarchy for all practical purposes. Religion and monarchy have always had a symbiotic relationship. The ruler needs a justification for his power and usually claims that God or the gods have given him that power. Either they arranged for him to be born into the royal family, or they gave him victory in battle, or both. This relief from the coronation cathedral of the French kings depicts Abraham and the priest Melchizedek, establishing the tradition that every king crowned in this cathedral would follow. The priest blesses the victorious general, who pledges a tithe of his spoils to the temple. But how does a king go from chosen by the gods to becoming a god himself? In Mesopotamia, worship of a king was very rare. In fact, I know of only one such case, and it offers an example of a grassroots deification. The inscription on this fragmentary statue, darn it, sorry about that. I am having trouble with the technology. This inscription, which you see enlarged in the detail here, tells us that Naram-Sin of the Akkadian Empire won 9 great battles in a single year. Definitely an overachiever. 8 cities of his empire were so awed by this achievement that they requested permission to build temples to him, not to the gods who had given him victory, but to him, Naram-Sin. His deification, then, seems to have been a spontaneous movement rather than imposed from above. This relief depicts Naram-Sin in his divine glory, twice as tall as any other figure. The bull's horns on his helmet are the attributes of a god. Naram-Sin strides up a mountain ahead of his troops, while the dead or dying enemies fall before him or beg for mercy. But the king answers to a higher power. These 3 radiant discs above his head, they are the highest gods in the Mesopotamian pantheon, represented by the sun, the moon, and the planet Venus. The sculptors do not attempt to represent these gods in human form. After Naram-Sin, no other Mesopotamian king ever received divine honors. A devastating drought and famine brought down the Akkadian Empire not long after his reign, and the cult of the ruler perished with it. Egypt, however, was another story. The geography and the climate allowed much more stability than that of Mesopotamia. The predictable floods of the Nile usually delivered fertile soil, and the country had defensible borders on all sides. The Nile provided a means of communication that allowed early kings to unify and then govern the entire region from the cataracts to the delta. From the Old Kingdom onward, the king was the living embodiment of Egypt, and that aspect of his being was sacred. Everyone knew that he would age and die. Everyone knew that the previous king was his biological father. But during his life, one of his titles was the son of Amun Ra, the sun god. The living king would worship and make offerings to his own divine alter ego. After the king died, a college of priests would worship the immortal aspect of his being, his Ka, or soul. The statue on your left depicts Khafre, builder of the second pyramid. The statue may have been made while he was still alive, because one had to plan early if you were building a pyramid for your tomb, but it was made for his mortuary temple, and that was where it was found. The falcon of the god Horus embraces him, his wings merging into the royal headcloth so that the two almost become one. The vines and the hieroglyph that form the rungs of his throne express the unity of Upper and Lower Egypt, which the king embodies. On the right is a fresco from the tomb of a much later king, Amenhotep III. The murals depict his journey through the underworld, and during the hours of the night, and during each hour, his senses and powers return to him one by one. The journey concludes with the return of his life force to the sun. The mural ends by the door, where the mourners would enter and leave the burial chamber. At the end of the middle register, that is the middle tier of scenes in this fresco, the scarab beetle that represents renewal of life pushes the sun disk through the horizon. In the lower register, the king's mortal body remains behind, where figures in front of him worship him. Now, Egyptians believe that everyone, royal or not, has a Ka, or immortal soul, and private citizens would make regular offerings to their dead relatives. The king's cults, however, were part of the official religion and often continued for many centuries after those kings had died. Monarchy had existed for many centuries in Macedonia and in some of the Greek city-states, but the concept of divine kingship entered those societies from Egypt by way of Alexander the Great. Alexander's father, Philip of Macedon, conquered the Greek city-states of mainland Greece with a combination of force and diplomacy. Once he controlled the mainland, his plan was to liberate the Greek cities of Asia Minor from the Persian Empire. There's nothing like a common enemy to unite people behind a leader, but Philip was assassinated on the eve of that invasion. His son Alexander needed to secure his own claim to power, and so Alexander led that army. The results were beyond his and Philip's wildest dreams. Not only did he liberate the Greek cities, he defeated the entire Persian army, putting Alexander in command of an enormous empire that included Egypt. Now, Alexander was a clever politician, and he set about winning hearts and minds in Egypt, which had never liked the Persians very much, by showing his respect for that ancient culture and for its gods. At Siva, way over here to the west of the Nile Delta, and quite far west in the desert, there was an oasis and an oracular shrine of the god Amun Ra. Alexander made a pilgrimage there, which was no easy journey, to ask the oracle how he could avenge the murder of his father. The oracle replied, "You cannot, because your father is Amun Ra, who is alive." Now, this was marvelous news for everyone. If Alexander was the son of Amun Ra, then he was the legitimate ruler of Egypt rather than a foreign conqueror, and they could accept him without any loss of face. Meanwhile, Greeks and Macedonians considered Amun Ra to be another name for their supreme god, Zeus. Alexander immediately set about informing the rest of his subjects of his divine birth. His mint issued these coins, which show Alexander's face. Oh, there I go again. I'm reaching for the laser pointer and hitting the forward button, sorry about that. But they show Alexander's face wearing the lion skin of Hercules, while Zeus, on the reverse, extends a hand holding an eagle. Note, however, that the makers of these coins do not identify Alexander with one of the Olympian gods. Hercules was the son of the supreme god by a mortal woman. He had to earn his immortality by his heroic deeds. Alexander's successors, after his death, went much farther. Lysimachus of Thrace issued coins portraying Alexander with the ram's horns of the Egyptian god Amun Ra. The statue on the right depicts Amun in the form of a ram. No longer is Alexander a mere demigod, but an avatar of Amun Ra, in other words, of Zeus. All the claimants to Alexander's power followed his example by demanding divine honors during their lifetimes. However, Alexander's empire soon disintegrated into warring kingdoms. All these Hellenistic kings hoped someday to reunite Alexander's territory, but while they slugged it out with each other, no one noticed until it was too late that a new superpower was emerging in Italy, and that, of course, was Rome. The word king in Latin had the same implications for Romans as dictator or tyrant do for us today. No Roman emperor ever called himself a king, although for all practical purposes he was. Romans had expelled a dynasty of kings in about 510 BCE, and they were proud of being a republic. As they became involved in wars among the Hellenistic states, however, they came into contact with divine kingship. The Roman general Titus Quinctius Flaminius won a major victory over Macedonia in 198 BCE, and 2 years later, at the Isthmian Games, which was one of those great events like the Olympian Games that would draw in people from all over the Greek world, Flaminius declared the freedom of the Greek states from Macedonian rule. We are told that the crowd responded uproariously with applause and cheers and treated Flaminius like a great hero. The Macedonian mint struck these coins with his name and image, and this is the first known portrait of a Roman ever to appear on a coin. Until then, only the faces of gods had appeared on the obverses of Roman coinage. The Macedonian die cutters give him the same rock star look as Alexander, with dramatically flowing hair. His features are quite realistic in the Roman style, and he has no godlike attributes. However, the city of Chalkis dedicated a temple to Titus and Apollo, putting his name right up there next to that of the Olympian god. Over the 3rd to 1st centuries BCE, the government of Rome was less and less able to control a large empire. Cults of personality formed around successful generals like Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Julius Caesar. The soldiers who served under each of these men often had more loyalty to their commanders than they did to a system of government. So when Sulla or Caesar told their men to march against Rome, they did it. After a long and bitter series of civil wars, Caesar emerged as the most powerful man in the empire. The Senate gave him the title of dictator, which in Latin simply meant a leader with special emergency powers. Funny how all these words like dictator and so on start out innocent enough and then take on nasty connotations because of the people who abuse those powers. But anyway, the Senate renewed that authority as dictator several years in a row. Finally, in 44 BCE, they made him dictator in perpetuity, which is what it says on this coin. Dictator, abbreviated DICT, and then perpetuo, in perpetuity. And some people call this the coin that killed Julius Caesar, because not long afterward, a group of senators assassinated him on the Ides of March in 44 BCE. The conspirators expected the public to rally to their cause, but Caesar was a more beloved figure than they had realized. A crowd of Caesar's followers seized and cremated his body in the Roman Forum, which was not the usual place for funerals. Normally, cremations took place outside the city, in a green area called the Campus Martius. Caesar's followers then treated that spot in the Forum like a shrine. At about the same time, a very bright comet appeared in the sky, so bright that it could actually be seen in daylight. Caesar's followers took that as an omen that Caesar had ascended to the heavens. The denarius, the silver coin on your right, represents the comet, the star of the divine Julius, and one of its rays looks a lot like the thunderbolt of Jupiter. In 42 BCE, 2 years after Caesar's death, the Roman Senate finally voted to recognize Caesar as a demigod, or divus, as opposed to a deus, which would mean one of the major Olympian gods. But the Senate was ratifying a grassroots cult that already existed. That senatorial decree proved very useful to Caesar's adopted son Octavian Caesar, who could now call himself Caesar, son of the deified Caesar. Octavian Caesar was the man who later received the title of Augustus. There was one more round of civil wars between Octavian and Antony, and you know how that ended, with the defeat and deaths of Antony and Cleopatra. When Octavian returned to Rome, one of his first orders of business was to build a temple for the cult of Julius Caesar. The temple stood at the spot in the Roman Forum where the funeral pyre had been, facing west along the main axis of the Forum. If you visit the ruins of that temple today, you will usually still see flowers and coins that visitors have thrown on the altar. So he still has his fans even now. Subsequent emperors quickly learned the value of having a deified father. Augustus, like Julius Caesar, received the formal divine honors from the Senate after his death. Temples were built for his cult throughout the empire, from Gaul to Asia Minor. People of the provinces could demonstrate their loyalty to the ruling family through devotion to these cults. Claiming to be a demigod while still alive remained taboo. The only two emperors who attempted it, Caligula and Domitian, were both assassinated. But from 54 CE onward, every emperor who did not die in a coup received that good housekeeping seal of approval. Frequently, their mothers, wives, or daughters did as well, because they were mothers of potential heirs to power. On one occasion, however, the process did not go smoothly. Hadrian, who ruled the empire from 117 until 138 CE, had alienated the Senate with many of his policies. And he was also suspected, although it was not proven, of having whacked a few senators who stood in his way of power. So they did not want to vote divine honors to him. Hadrian's adopted son Antoninus Pius had to coerce the Senate by threatening to step down from imperial power unless they consecrated Hadrian. Failure to deify Hadrian, he argued, amounted to a vote of no confidence in everything the late emperor had done, including his adoption of Antoninus. Well, faced with the prospect of civil war, the Senate quickly caved. This incident demonstrates the vital role that emperor worship had now come to play in the legitimacy of the government. And that brings us to the subject of Antoninus Pius. The coins and works of art in honor of this emperor and his wife give us some of our most detailed depictions of the rituals of deification. The body is cremated or buried right away, according to the usual funeral customs. However, a wax effigy lies in state in the imperial residence for 7 more days. Aristocratic women keep a vigil at the bedside, while doctors arrange to examine the patient. Finally, on the 7th day, they confirm the news of his death. This bizarre ritual had a practical purpose because it bought the time necessary to build the imperial funeral pyre. They couldn't have the body sitting around that long for obvious hygienic reasons. This timber structure was enormous, built in ascending tiers, and filled with tinder and aromatic herbs. As you can see, there are 4 stories, the lowest one draped in fabric and garlands of flowers. The second and third bear either paintings or relief sculptures, or possibly both. On the uppermost tier is a statue of the emperor in a 4-horse chariot. The historian Herodian tells us that the materials were very costly, including ivory, purple, and cloth of gold, and were offered by the various provinces as their tributes to the deceased. So the funeral offered provincial regions an opportunity to vie with one another in displays of wealth, all in the name of piety. After the physicians announced the emperor's death, pallbearers would carry the gorgeously decorated bier with the wax effigy to the funeral pyre, and it also would have been beautifully decorated with ivory inlay and gold and purple tapestries. They would place the bier on the second terrace of the pyre, which you can see is just very sketchily indicated here. And horsemen and chariots paraded counterclockwise around the structure. Then the mourners used their torches to set it all on fire, and all those precious materials went up in flames. Major conspicuous consumption. As the pyre blazed up, Herodian tells us that from the topmost and smallest story, as if from a battlement, an eagle flies forth, soaring with the flames into the sky. The Romans believed that this eagle carries the soul of the emperor from the earth up to heaven. Thereafter, the emperor is worshipped with the rest of the gods. The eagle would probably have been kept in a cage at the top of the pyre for this moment. I am not the only person to worry about the fate of the poor bird if the latch mechanism ever failed to open the cage on cue. Therefore, I think or hope that the cage would be opened before the pyre was lit. Perhaps the eagle was bribed with a few treats not to fly away just yet, but then the thermal updrafts from the fire, combined with sheer terror, would cause him to fly directly upward. This bronze coin commemorates the deification of Antoninus's wife Faustina, who died 20 years before her husband. The die cutter depicts the eagle's flight to the heavens, carrying Faustina on his back. Faustina and Antoninus died 2 decades apart. However, their successors Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus honored their divine parents with this monument that depicts the deification of both of them as though they had happened at the same time. This huge marble block was the base of a tall column that supported a statue of the couple. At the ground level, the original viewers would have seen the ritual of consecration. Then they could gaze upward at the 2 figures that appeared to soar into the heavens at the top of the column. The column and the statues are now long gone, but the base survives. The front of this block, which you don't see, carries the inscription, and that's how we know for sure what it was and what it did. The opposite face, which you see here, represents the ascension to heaven allegorically. The other 2 sides bear nearly identical scenes of the cavalry processions. The human figures in the parade reliefs are quite realistic, and they do not receive heroic treatment. They're short and squat, and the sculptors show much more interest in the details of their armor than in graceful proportions. The side that represents the couple ascending, however, makes full use of classical traditions and the classical canons of beauty. A young winged figure carries the divine couple to the heavens. He is Ion, or eternity, holding a globe and the serpent of Ouroboros, the serpent that bites its tail and represents the unbroken cycle of time. Eagles of apotheosis escort both figures. Below, the personified Campus Martius, shown as a beautiful young man, witnesses their ascension along with the personified city of Rome. His attribute is an obelisk that was a familiar landmark nearby. Augustus brought that obelisk as booty from Egypt after his victory over Cleopatra and dedicated it to the sun god as the pointer of a huge sundial. Roma's attribute is a shield decorated with the Roman wolf nursing Romulus and Remus. I think you can just see them there. Both images associate the deified emperor and empress with Rome's glorious past, both legendary and historic. After the ceremony of consecration, what would happen? Well, written messages and coins, like the ones I showed earlier, would quickly spread the news of the deification to the provinces. Coins, by their nature, travel far and fast and reach a lot of people. Statues of the new divus or diva would soon become very familiar sights, not only in temples, but in all sorts of public buildings. Bathhouses, theater facades, and public fountains like this one all provided showplaces for demonstrations of loyalty. Herodes Atticus was a wealthy and very well-connected Athenian who had taught philosophy to the young Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. That's friends in high places. His wife, Annia Regilla, was an aristocratic Roman lady related to the imperial family, so she had friends in high places too. In the mid-2nd century CE, this power couple decided that the great sanctuary of Zeus at Olympia needed a convenient source of water. They constructed an aqueduct to bring water to the site and decorated the basin with a tall colonnaded facade. The smaller upper niches held the statues of themselves and their relatives. Of course, the donor gets to put his name on things in big gold letters and have his portrait on them. But the large niches at eye level displayed portraits of the imperial family and its deified ancestors. The statue of the deified Faustina that you see here is one of the better preserved examples. In Rome, the Senate built a temple to Faustina on the Roman Forum, the first such temple to be placed so close to the center of Rome's government. Earlier temples to imperial cults tended to be out beyond the boundaries of the city. The Senate probably anticipated that eventually it would also become the temple of Antoninus, as indeed it did. All that remains of the temple now is the colonnade, which has been incorporated into the Church of San Lorenzo, but the inscription is still legible. Originally, it read, "To the deified Faustina by decree of the Senate." After Antoninus died and was deified, this line was added above hers, "To the deified Antoninus and the deified Faustina by decree of the Senate." Even before his death, however, a statue of Antoninus and Faustina stood in the temple clasping hands. This coin identifies him as Antoninus Augustus, but not Divus Antoninus Augustus, so he was still alive at the time. On the reverse, we can just see in these rather simple stick figures the statue of the emperor and empress inside the temple, clasping hands. That was the gesture that solemnized marriage and also represented concordia, or harmony. A large and better preserved bronze coin shows a clearer image of that group. And in fact, here the emperor is also holding a little statuette of Concordia in his hand as he and his wife clasp hands. Below them is a smaller couple, also clasping hands. We are told that young couples would make offerings at the altar in front of this temple before their weddings. They would thus display both their patriotism and their commitment to the values of marital harmony. But would they pray for anything else? No, probably not. One didn't pray to a deified emperor for children. That was up to the goddess Juno Lucina. If people wanted healing from an illness, they prayed to Asclepius or Apollo. And if they wanted personal spiritual fulfillment, as well as hope for an afterlife, they joined one of the mystery cults like those of Isis and Serapis. So, what purpose did the imperial cults serve? They provided the living emperor with a basis for his claims to power. They allowed him to display his devotion towards his dead relatives. The cults gave people in the provinces a way to express loyalty to the empire and for elite citizens to curry favor with the ruling dynasty. They offered a way for freedmen to celebrate their newly acquired citizenship by participating in the state religion. And so we end where we began. The dead emperor and empress receive prayers and offerings, but the practical benefits of the cult accrue to the living. Thank you.